Davis steps under center. Gibson and McClendon behind him. Davis with motion by Richard. Will give the ball to McClendon. He leaps. Oh, he doesn't get in. He fumbled the football. Carolina holds. The game is over. And Carolina has won the game.
Finley to throw. Over the middle, intercepted. Wolford again. Wolford the other way at the 30, the 40. Wolford to midfield. Miles Wolford with the pick. The heels on the doorstep of an enormous victory.
Left side of the line. Hood standing to Williams' right. Williams gonna throw. One-on-one. Davis has it. Touchdown. Carolina wins. Carolina is the Coastal Division champion. Bernard fields it at the 26. Heading to the far side. Gio at the 35. Gio, he's at the 50. No, he's not. Yes, he is. Gio is going to take it for a touchdown. Are you kidding me? Connor Barth for the possible win. Snap, spot, kick away, high enough, long enough. It's good! It's good! Carolina has won the game on a 42-yard field goal by freshman Connor Barth. Good gosh, dirty!
This is the Heel Tough Blog Podcast.
Hey guys, and welcome to another edition of the Heel Tough Blog Podcast. It's your host, Anthony Pagnotta, with you guys as always, and for the first time in a while, it is Zack Hubbard back with us, joining us. First time since we previewed the month of June. We knew that there was going to be some action, and Carolina has landed their first commitment since the month of February, so he is with us to talk about that. We've got a couple other guys that have been visiting campus so far, a couple of important upcoming official visits this weekend. We'll preview some of those with you guys, and of course we'll look back to that first weekend that had so many official visits as well that were extremely important for Carolina, and it's going to be a great episode. And we start off, as we mentioned, Carolina's first commit since back on February 24th was the last time Carolina had a commit. That was from an in-state edge rusher. This one also from an in-state edge rusher, a 4-star as well, in Leesville Road High School's Beau Atkinson. Carolina lands their second in-state recruit of the class, their second edge rusher of the class in Beau Atkinson. And I know, Zach, when you saw this, you probably, had a little bit of understanding of, what Carolina was looking for and what they got in Beau Atkinson. I think this is a guy that a lot of people probably that don't follow recruiting as in depth probably don't know a whole lot about, because he is a recent offer for Carolina, just received an offer back on June 4th, but this is a really good commitment for Carolina. This is a guy that he just became a 4-star. Don't see how he wasn't already a 4-star. And I think this is somebody that Carolina fans are really going to grow to love as they start to learn a little bit more about him.
Absolutely. Like you mentioned, just a recent offer here within the month of June, so this moved pretty quickly. But he was a guy, at least in state, that has been on the radar as a Power 5 guy, as even a high-end Power 5 guy, sort of at the national level. I mean, you look at, for those that saw his tweet yesterday, I mean, his top three, or his final three, rather, was North Carolina, Miami, and Michigan, if I remember correctly. So he had, legit national interest from some of these programs that we see regularly competing in that top 25 and, competing at the highest level. But like you mentioned, a pretty quick recruitment here. The in-state school, North Carolina, offered, got him in a camp setting, was able to see him. I think that was sort of the trepidation that we saw, and the reason that there have been not as many prospects, not only because spots are limited in the 2022 class, but just because for schools across the country with this class, I mean, they have not seen real verified technique, verified height, weight, speed, things along those lines in a good while. So Beau Atkinson, was a guy that they wanted to see, up close and personal. was able to see him verified, sort of what makes him special, gave him that offer, and then just a few weeks later, and here he is committed. In terms of who he is as a prospect, to move into that, I think what jumps off is just his size. Listed at 6'6", 240, he's got a really, really good build, and I think he allows some positional versatility as well. Like you mentioned, sort of projecting as an edge rusher type, but with that frame, potentially, if they wanted to, it's not out of the question that he could, gain 40 to 50 pounds and play defensive end, or even just stay sort of where he is, and then, on very pass rush heavy snaps, they could move him sort of to that 4-eye position on a singular snap basis. But offers that versatility, great motor, great size, good arm length, and really just plays with the strength about him. I think that's one of the primary characteristics that I noticed in this film is just he's getting physical with guys, and of course that's something that you always love to see, sort of that old-fashioned mentality of we're gonna go out and we're gonna be physical with you, and we're gonna put it all on the line. So I really like this pickup. I think that it is, a guy that they were able to thankfully get on campus. It's always great, as we discussed, to get these in-state guys when you have that talent. That's one of the things that North Carolina has really focused on and made part of its culture. It is really sort of locking down the state of North Carolina, making their team built up of first and foremost North Carolina guys. And, as we've seen over the past couple of years, the state of North Carolina is continuously getting more talented. And here's just another example of that.
Yeah, he's a guy, and I know that a lot of people look and say with him, well, he didn't have Clemson, he didn't have Ohio State up there. I mean, you look at the past history at Miami and Michigan, even in the recent past here, they have had some really good defensive linemen that have come through there. So I think that should show you what you need to know about him, that he had those two schools recruiting him at a high level. And like you said, 6'6", 240, I think one thing that people need to realize with that size is he comes in bigger than Des Evans was when he entered campus. So this is a guy that if he's staying on the edge, he's already got a really good frame. And this is a frame that, you can probably make an impact with early if you need to. In terms of the position flexibility, I'm not really sure. I think that's more, what does Carolina kind of see his role as? And I think, part of that is going to depend on how they feel about the edge rushers. Because you have to remember that after this year, you are going to be losing Timon Fox off the edge. You are going to be losing Tyrone Hopper off the edge. So I think, it'll depend on what do they see from guys like Des Evans, Kamen Rucker, who's going to move out to the edge this year, play there a little more often. He'll probably show some of that flexibility that you think you could see at some point with Atkinson. And Chris Collins, another guy there. But if those guys can perform well, then yeah, you might see them try to add some weight to him, maybe see if he can play a little bit inside. But I think it really all depends on how they feel out there on the edge. And I mean, look, if they keep him on the edge, he's going to be fine. He's not the fastest guy. That's really going to be more of what you're going to see from Hamrick. Hamrick's going to be a guy, especially, and that shouldn't shock you, but especially with his size, he's going to be that guy that's going to be more speed-oriented off the edge. Like you mentioned, I mean, Beau Atkinson plays with a lot of physicality. He has no problem throwing offensive tackles, even guards aside. He likes the physicality. He welcomes it. But I think the main thing that I took away from watching his film, and you mentioned it a little bit there, was the motor. He plays every play the same exact way. He doesn't take plays off. Again, I think, people will, that's kind of a cliche because you say, well, shouldn't everybody play hard on every play? I mean, yeah, but, it's natural for, sometimes when you get worn down for you not to put as much effort into some plays if a run's going to the other side, or if a quarterback scrambles out of the pocket and takes off and beats you, for you to just say, all right, somebody downfield is going to get him. Let me conserve a little bit of energy. But, I mean, he's a guy that multiple times you see him chasing down plays from behind on film. He's just, I mean, he's an animal. He gets after it every single play. One of the other things that I liked a lot about him as well was his release off the line of scrimmage. It's a very quick release, and that's extremely important for defensive linemen. If they can get out of their stance quickly and beat some of those offensive linemen to the spot, into those gaps, it allows you to get a little bit of an advantage and allows you to establish a little bit of leverage, and he did that very often on film. I think the biggest thing for him, is he's going to have to add some technical elements to his game as a pass rusher. He's really more of just, he wins off of strength and that release off the line of scrimmage. The release won't go away. The strength advantage could against some stronger and faster offensive linemen at the college level. So I think some of those technical aspects of his game he may have to develop in terms of establishing a swim move, a more consistent swim move, maybe working in some other finesse moves there as well. But this guy's got it. He's going to be a really, really good player in this class. And, one of the things that I think people, will probably look at is now Carolina, this is their 5th commit of the class. So you mentioned that this is going to be a smaller class. The area that I've kind of been hearing from some of the recruiting insiders that are a little more tied to what Carolina does is that it's probably going to be somewhere in the mid-teens. I think at this point, this kind of shuts down any more edge rushers in this class, which means a guy like DJ Wesselak, who was just on campus this past week, is probably out of the equation. I think, one of the things that people are wondering is, does this mean that Carolina is not going to take on any other, guys that potentially get after the passer outside of course, Travis Shaw? What do you think about that? Does this appear like Carolina is probably done in terms of defensive linemen and edge rushers outside of Shaw?
There's a significant possibility of that. Now, in a lot of these recruitments, there are some times where, and it's going to depend on how talented the staff really thinks some guys are. You get in some situations where you have, a set goal for how many recruits at a certain position you want to get, and you get a scenario where you have, a guy that's just too talented to turn away. So that's going to be really the question here with a lot of these guys that you mentioned, such as DJ Wesselak, Bryson Jennings, another sort of edge rusher type. Mm-hmm. And then Xavier Simmons is another name who can, potentially play at both linebacker spots. So it's really a question of, where do you see these guys landing? What is your evaluation of them? Is it worth, letting them go somewhere else and just trying to make the numbers work? But just at a general, at a 50,000 feet level, I do think they are likely done. As you mentioned, they do have some, other positions that they are still trying to fill, and with the spots being sort of in that mid-teens, I mean, that's pretty small for a recruiting class, and that's, somewhat the norm through most of these classes that we're seeing across the country, with, sort of a gray area on, scholarship help after this past year of having, seniors being able to repeat their senior year and everyone getting an additional year of eligibility. And of course, the transfer portal has become a big part of the recruiting game as well. So in terms of purely high school recruiting, I think spots are limited, like you mentioned. So Malachi Hamrick and Beau Atkinson, those could be your two sort of edge rusher types in this class, but we'll definitely see moving forward.
Yeah, and I think Carolina would live with that. You get two really talented in-state prospects, two guys that are inside of that umbrella that I think most people are looking for when you're trying to get to the level where Carolina is on the offensive and defensive lines, which is guys that are inside of that top 500 that we've talked about a lot here on this show. And they've got two really solid players. I think the interesting one, you mentioned him in there, is Bryson Jennings. That'll be one name to keep an eye on. Do they deem him a guy that they would be willing to take on maybe create an extra spot for. I think one thing that is telling when it comes to just the defensive line and edge rushers, if you combine them into one category, is, we kind of wonder why Carolina was not as aggressive with, a guy like Curtis Neal, who's a 3-star in-state guy who, Carolina was out of the running pretty early for him. Santana Hopper, another guy out of Shelby High School, same high school as Malachi Hamrick, who Carolina offered. I think a lot of people thought that Carolina was going to be a heavy factor in that recruitment. That doesn't appear to be the case. But I think now we're sort of seeing that Carolina they're having to make some really difficult decisions when it comes to picking and choosing their targets in this class because, as you mentioned, this is a smaller class and they still have needs that they have to go after. One of those positions where it feels like Carolina still has a need that they do have to go after is at running back. Again, it's really just about continuing to establish depth there. Of course, you're going to lose a guy that you would feel like is going to be a pretty big producer for you this year in graduate transfer Ty Chandler after the year is over. So there looks like there will still be opportunity there. Carolina is in the running for some really big prospects in this class, guys that are high-end 4-stars, close to being 5-stars. I think the guy you've got to start with is Amari Hampton. Since the start of June, Hampton has been on campus at least twice. There's rumored to be a third time that he was on campus. And one of the other rumors that was really interesting around him is that he apparently, according to some people that have tossed some information my way, apparently he did leave his Auburn visit early. So that is something. That was an official visit. It's very, very rare that you're going to see a guy, even if they're not really having the best time, usually they're going to stick it out because, it's basically a weekend vacation at a place. Maybe you stick it out, see if maybe some things change and you can change your mind and figure out whether or not that team is actually a legitimate contender. But Carolina, he has visited there pretty often. He visited there a lot last year during the pandemic because it was so close, and it seems like the Tar Heels have a really, really good opportunity to land one of the best running backs in the state of North Carolina.
Absolutely, like you mentioned, or just to give an overview here, Hampton is a guy that went ahead and for the month of June set these official visits, setting visits to Florida, Auburn, which are the two he's already been to, and then Penn State and Ohio State, sort of for each of the 4 June weekends that we have. But as you mentioned, he's been to North Carolina, it seems like 2 or 3 times. I've heard sort of the same things, that he did leave Auburn a little bit early and did show up, on campus sort of that in that same weekend time. So even with these sort of cross-country visits that Amari Hampton is taking, there's a continuous documented pattern of he's constantly coming back to North Carolina. So you have to look at that and see some legitimate interest there if he's taking the time to show up continuously on campus. And could look to take an official visit here in the fall, depending on what his commitment schedule looks like. But certainly a guy that's got to be high up on that board in the running back room. Another guy that's made an unofficial visit that's probably also important to mention here, running back out of Virginia in George Petaway, probably sort of vying for that top running back spot with Amari Hampton as one of these blue chip prospects that North Carolina is recruiting. But in the past few weeks, he's made an unofficial visit as well. Was sort of questionable on if he's going to take an official visit to North Carolina, as was a local school, has since affirmed he is in fact going to officially visit North Carolina. So, and then another one to mention here would be Damari Alston, another running back that's visited recently unofficially, that's sort of in that loop there. So North Carolina has some options in terms of guys that they get, whether that be, just one running back or a pair of running backs. It feels like that North Carolina, especially with the success that we saw from their tandem from the past year, Javonte Williams and Michael Carter in the NFL draft, feels like that North Carolina has a lot of equity with recruits at that position. And I think really with any combination of these guys, and another one to mention, of course, and Michael Allen, another in-state prospect that North Carolina is recruiting, really any combination of those guys, whether it be one or two, you're going to have a good running back class. And I feel pretty strongly that they're going to have a good class of running backs in 2022.
Oh, I'm 100% with you on that. I think the interesting guy, the most interesting out of that group was probably Alston, because I feel like, and I don't know if you felt the same way, it felt like there was a little bit of separation between the other three guys that they were recruiting in Alston. It felt like almost to a certain extent, Carolina was, maybe not them backing off, but maybe Alston was kind of backing off of Carolina a little bit. That, he ends up taking an unofficial visit, made it pretty well known that he was fitting Carolina in, and I think that is pretty telling for sure. The other thing with with Petaway, it was basically from what people have been saying, he was there the entire weekend. It was an unofficial visit, but it's pretty close to an official visit. If you're there the entire weekend, you're basically going through an official visit. It's just that you're paying for everything yourself. Whereas when you're on an official visit, everything is paid for by the school. So, and he's done that with a couple of schools too. It's not just Carolina, but it seems like what he's doing, and this is probably smart considering that you haven't been able to meet some of these coaches face to face. You haven't been to a lot of these campuses, as he's just trying to kind of feel things out throughout the summer, and then maybe as they get into the fall, sometime early in the fall, maybe you could see him make a decision. That kind of feels like where you would see him make that decision. But I think, put it this way, I think he's going to take longer than a guy like Amari and Hampton. I think Hampton is doing his homework now, and I would be shocked if he makes it to the start of his senior year of high school football in the fall and is not committed somewhere. And I think that's going to be one of the other interesting things because, as we talked about a little bit ago here, this class is small, but I think if in a certain combination of guys and if they go off the board in a certain order, I think Carolina would clear space. So let's say that Amari and Hampton was to go ahead and commit to Carolina. I think if George Petaway wanted to commit to Carolina, that feels like a guy that they would make sure he's got a spot. Whereas if they feel that the class is small, if they feel like it's a bit restrictive to them to add another running back, I'm not sure that they would take on a guy like Michael Allen or Damari Alston if they feel like other spots, could fill up, if there's potential at some of these other positions to land a guy or two, or if there's a position where they feel like they still have somebody that they need. What do you feel about that? Do you feel like that's kind of where Carolina would be at, where if Petaway was to, or Hampton, let's say Petaway went ahead and committed early, do you feel like, either of those two guys probably have a spot, whereas the other two guys, it kind of depends on what happens with Hampton and Petaway above them?
I'm kind of there with you that amongst the four, I think there are sort of a clear top two in Petaway and Hampton. And I also think, sort of as we mentioned before, the spots are limited, but there is potential, at least in my opinion, that if they have certain prospects that are too talented to turn away, that they will figure out the scholarship numbers one way or the other to get those guys in the class. And I think that, like you mentioned, Petaway or Hampton, those are the guys that you're going to make room for. So I do think that there are scenarios in which, you have either Petaway or Hampton out there, in a scenario in which, you have one guy that you give the green light to, and that goes ahead and commits, and you have another one on the board. I don't think that you're going to turn that guy away necessarily. And I think maybe a little bit less than the outside linebacker position or edge position that we already mentioned. I think running back is definitely a position in which they could consider that, especially with these guys on board. I feel strongly that North Carolina is at least going to get one of them between Petaway and Hampton. But, the staff definitely has options here. I mean, it's not just based on the star rankings. The staff has their own opinions. maybe they have Allen or Alston on the board a little bit higher than we might think. So, you never know. But you're more likely than not getting one or two blue chip running backs in this class to sort of reload what you lost last year in Williams and Carter. So, again, to the conclusion, I think North Carolina is just going to continue to add talent to this room, continue to add talent to this roster in a way that we, as we've mentioned on multiple podcasts, they're looking to build this roster to be an ACC contender and a national contender. And I think they're putting in the effort on the recruiting trail to do that.
Well, we go from a position where Carolina's got a lot of targets that are still available to a position that now looks a little bit thinner in terms of their targets and really allows Carolina to sort of focus on one guy here. That's at safety, of course. Some of you guys may have saw the news. If you didn't see the news today, Sherrod Koval, the 4-star safety prospect out of Oscar Smith High School in Chesapeake, Virginia. Not shocking. He ends up committing to Clemson. Recently received an offer, took an official visit there. He was scheduled to take an official visit to Carolina. That got canceled pretty much the first day that he was on campus at Clemson. And I think at that moment, everybody kind of knew that Clemson was the place that he was going. He revealed that today at the Rivals Challenge that they had down in Atlanta, which is the top 100 players from the from all the tours that they do with their camps around the country, where everybody comes out. Those are the top players. He went there, announced his commitment today at the end of the camp, and that really allows Carolina to sort of focus on Jake Pope, a guy that Carolina had on campus on the first weekend after the dead period wrapped up. He was on campus from June 4th through the 6th, and everything seemed to go pretty well for Carolina, actually to the point where Steve Wilfong put in a crystal ball for the Tar Heels. But since then, that crystal ball has been rescinded. There is a lot coming out of Notre Dame that his visit there was really, really good. So it's kind of hard to get a read on exactly where he's at because, look, he's taken 2 visits. After the first one, it seemed like Carolina was going to be in the driver's seat. Really tough for someone to beat them. Then he goes to Notre Dame. Now they get the crystal ball prediction. Steve Wilfong pulls the crystal ball prediction from Carolina. They're saying that recruitment is now going in the favor of Notre Dame. That visit went great. So he seems like a guy that right now people think is really reactionary. It'll be interesting to see, but I think with Koval off the board here, this sort of allows Carolina to turn up the heat on Pope. And, look, you're a guy that, not only knows a lot about Carolina recruiting, also knows a lot about Alabama recruiting. That's another one of the teams that's right in the thick of things for him. Is Alabama someone to worry about here? And, ultimately, where do you think Carolina's at in this recruitment after, suddenly getting the crystal ball pulled and Notre Dame seeming to now be back in the driver's seat?
Mentioned will visit Alabama soon. We'll also visit Ohio State, so that if there's going to be a fourth team that you have to worry about in this recruitment, it would be them. But this is a recruitment that is first and foremost a dogfight coming out of these official visits. We saw, like you mentioned, some positive momentum with North Carolina coming out of that first weekend, and then saw that seemingly flip to Notre Dame, the weekend after. So this is one that is going to be a battle here. Now, when you look at sort of those, what you consider elite programs, when you look at the Ohio State, at the Alabama, it really is somewhat of a question of, do they have some guys that might be, a little bit more nationally known on the board? And I think it's somewhat hard to say to some extent. Like we mentioned in discussing Beau Atkinson, but is true across the country, is that staffs really don't have as much information on the 2022 class just because of COVID limiting the evaluation opportunities this past year. So I think with a lot of staffs, with schools like Alabama, with Ohio State that are consistently going to the playoff, they can be a little bit more choosy and they can, choose to get guys on campus. So as of right now, I would not view Alabama as, or Ohio State as one of the primary contenders. I still think it's between Notre Dame and UNC, but they could get him, in a workout setting. They could see him at either one of these locations and really like him, and then it's off to the races there. As we see with some of these recruitments, when you have schools like a Clemson, Ohio State, Alabama, they can get into a recruitment like that and be a primary player. But in my view, sort of going into these last official visits, I do think that obviously they're gonna put on a good time for him. But I do think it is going to come down to UNC and Notre Dame at the end. Obviously, it doesn't have a set commitment date, but like a lot of these prospects that are taking 4, if not 5 official visits in the month of June, I think we'll see a fair amount of commitments in July and August. Pope likely will be one of those guys. With that, I think it's going to come down to North Carolina and Notre Dame. I think that, Pope more likely than not is going to let these visits settle. He's going to have a few weeks or a few days where he can really think everything over. And I think it'll be sort of on the staff at North Carolina to continually recruit him. I mean, if you look at this recruitment sort of, at a macro level, this is big boy recruiting. You're recruiting against 3 of the 4 teams that were in the playoff this past year. So if you look at it that way, I mean, this is a big recruitment. Even, as just a 3-star, if you just want to view it as just a 3-star prospect. So I think that there is still work to do. I don't think North Carolina is out of it. But like you mentioned, with Koval off the board, this really becomes, the primary, if not only, safety target or, clear safety target that North Carolina has. I don't think that's necessarily the case at Notre Dame, Ohio State, or Alabama. So I think that if there's any factor specifically that can work in North Carolina's favor in this recruitment, I think it is the fact that he is going to be, he's going to get that individualized attention from North Carolina that he might not get from these other schools. So I think that's definitely something that's playing into their favor going into this recruitment. But it's still going to be a battle, throughout the summer, but it's one that we'll be watching closely at that safety position.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that's something that Jay Bateman should definitely sell to him is that, look, you are the guy on our board now. Look, there may be another guy, and I think if Carolina is really hell-bent on adding a safety in this class, which is possible because, look, there's a chance that you could lose Trey Morrison at the end of the year. Remember that, he is a senior, but you do have the super senior year that will be available to him if he wants it. Carolina could look there, and another thing with that is that Carolina's secondary last year did not play, or primarily the safeties did not play great, and they have talked about that. Mac Brown mentioned that in some of his spring press conferences, that they needed to see better play out of the safeties. So that could be an area that they see as a primary need and that they want to add somebody at. Marcus Allen would probably be the other guy you'd look at. He's a guy that can he's got some versatility to him. He can play either corner or safety. So I think, and it works kind of in Carolina's favor, where if they feel like they're not in the greatest spot with Pope, remember that Allen is visiting on the final weekend of June, the 25th through the 27th. So if you get a feeling that, Pope's probably leaning Notre Dame, you can turn up the heat then on Allen in that final week. But if Carolina feels good, I feel like they are going to probably push all their chips to the middle of the table, try to go all in on Pope. And I mean, it makes sense. This is a guy that Jay Bateman has liked since the word go. His 3-star rating means absolutely nothing to me. I've seen him play. I've watched him multiple times when I've watched Buford games. He is a guy that if this was a normal season where, you had guys that, that all the eyes were on them during the fall, if they were able to go to a lot of these prospect camps, he would easily be a 4-star prospect. He is a legit guy. There's a reason that Alabama and Ohio State have offered him. have at least made pushes at some point in his recruitment, even though they're right now not at the top. So yeah, this is a guy that Carolina holds in high regard and definitely should. Sticking in that defensive backfield, another guy that was on campus in that first weekend from the 4th to the 6th was Jaden Lucas out of Malden High School in Malden, South Carolina. And this is another guy where Carolina seemed to have a pretty significant impact in his recruitment. Carolina didn't end up getting a crystal ball prediction, but what did happen is after this visit, Steve Wiltfong, who was the director of recruiting at 24/7 Sports, he did drop the confidence level on his pick for Clemson all the way down to a 1. So he keeps the prediction for Clemson, but it seems like at this point, Carolina is as close as they have ever been in this recruitment to potentially taking over as the favorite over Clemson. I think at this point, Clemson is definitely still the favorite, but it feels like this is starting to become a neck-and-neck battle for his recruitment. And we've talked about this a couple of times already. Is Dre Bly going to be able to pull this off? And, is this what Carolina needed, especially with the fact that Clemson is a team that holds off on their official visits until the fall?
Absolutely. Like you mentioned, on campus that first weekend in June. After that visit, we saw clear impact of the significance or the momentum that North Carolina got out of that official visit weekend with Steve Wiltfong of 24/7 Sports dropping his crystal ball down to 1. And, this week reporting through some of their podcasting that that's probably where it's going to stay up until any sort of announcement, unless you hear something different, essentially that North Carolina and Clemson are neck and neck for Jaden Lucas, and that, he probably lean Clemson right now, but that's just by a hair. So, this is a pretty significant recruitment. We do discuss on this podcast pretty often about sort of these recruitments that you see Clemson and North Carolina battling for over the past few classes, and it's really been a sticking point and sort of one of those, maybe not obstacles, but goals that North Carolina is looking to accomplish on the recruiting front of, winning some of these battles against Clemson. Obviously, we've discussed the recruitment of Tony Grimes, of how Clemson sort of lost that momentum and UNC gained it. But, when you look at Lucas specifically, though he has mentioned, his family is not necessarily, Clemson alums or fans, it's in a heavy Clemson area. It's in South Carolina first and foremost, but it's in a Clemson area. So there's a lot of, reason, at least at face value, to just look at the geography and assume, he's going to go to Clemson. He's going to go to, Dabo Swinney's program. But North Carolina, Dre Bly specifically, has really put them in a position here to be a factor, not only in this recruitment, but I think another one to mention here briefly, of a guy that's going to visit here at the end of the month, and another highly rated quarterback in Dalen Everett, formerly out of the Tidewater area, now in IMG Academy in Bradenton, Florida. But this is another one in which you see Clemson and North Carolina really up there at the top. I think, in my opinion, they'd be the top 2 for both schools. And, it is not out of the question that you see, a scenario in which North Carolina gets both or goes 1-1 with Clemson. And I think that's an accomplishment in and of itself. And really speaks to sort of the acumen that we've seen of Dre Bly. We've mentioned it time and time again, not only his impact in the Tidewater area, but the way that he's able to connect with some of these defensive backs, the way that he's able to really sell himself not only as someone who's done it at Carolina, but as a defensive back coach, which is really great contrast, a really great turn of events after sort of the reporting that we saw when he was hired by Mac Brown. So with that, I think that these are both recruitments. Not to get off of Lucas entirely, but these are both recruitments sort of for a second or third cornerback, that are going to be hotly contested. But it really just speaks to, what UNC is building, that they are, this heavily involved with a highly rated recruit in Clemson's backyard, and that that Clemson's having to struggle for this really just speaks to how far North Carolina's come on that recruiting front, not only regionally but at a national level.
I'm going to tell you, I think if Carolina was able to pull this off, there is an argument to be made that even if they were to land Travis Shaw, this might be an even bigger statement than that, considering that this is a 5-star. And yeah, this is considered to be in Clemson's backyard, as they would say, with the quotations around it. It's a 45-minute drive. So this is not a guy that lives, right outside of campus. Like, there was a guy a couple of years ago, I don't know if you remember him, Cole Beck. He was a running back that Carolina was recruiting, ended up going to Virginia Tech, and this guy literally lived he lived in Blacksburg. He lived 5 minutes off of campus. This is a little bit of a different scenario, but especially in the state of South Carolina, if Clemson wants somebody, they are usually, in the last few years, they're usually going to get that prospect. So for Carolina to come in and don't get anything mixed up, no matter what people are telling you, Clemson fans, this is a prospect that Clemson wants badly because he is a 5-star prospect. He's a guy that, he's got, I'm not going to say it's the same exact skill set as Tony Grimes. Tony Grimes is a guy that was rated on some boards inside of the top 10. Jaden Lucas is a guy that's rated more towards, the lower 30s in terms of overall prospects. But this is still a guy that he's got the coverage ability to come in, and if you needed him to play snaps in week 1 for you, he could come in and probably put up a heck of a fight and show you a lot of potential as a true freshman. I think that there's a lot of people that will be put on notice if Carolina was able to pull this off. And a couple other guys really quick that have been on campus already. 4 official visits. Guys, for the first weekend, Sebastian Cheeks came on campus to Carolina from the 4th through the 6th. Just recently, this past weekend, took a visit to Texas, which is the other team that seems to be right now in that category of the favorites for him. That visit, haven't seen a ton on that visit, but it seems like things went at least decent because they haven't dropped any crystal ball predictions. They haven't lost any confidence. So seems like they're still in pretty good standing there. It looks like that could potentially come down to Carolina and Texas. A lot of people feel like Notre Dame's kind of out of that recruitment. They have guys that they see as bigger targets, just to be honest with you, on their board. So that's one. If Carolina wants him, I think Carolina definitely has an opportunity there. Another guy that has been on campus for an official visit came during the middle of this week. We told you a little bit about him. Another guy that was offered not too far in the past here is a guy out of Malden High School. Another guy, Deuce Caldwell. Interestingly enough, I found this out about him. I did not know this. He is actually not a student at Malden High School. He actually goes to, I believe it's Legacy Early College, or it could be Legion Collegiate High School, one of the two. Either way, both of those are prep schools. They don't have football programs, so he ends up playing his high school football at Malden High School. So in terms of a relationship with Jaden Lucas, apparently their relationship isn't as strong as some may think because they go to the same high school. So that is something that's pretty interesting. Carolina did host him for a visit. He's another one of those guys where if he receives a scholarship offer from Clemson, he would probably commit on the spot. We saw that, as I mentioned, with Sherrod Koval. It feels like that's probably the same boat that Carolina's in with Deuce Caldwell. If he doesn't receive that offer, though, Carolina looks like they could be in pretty good standing. UCF, who he's going to take an official visit to later in the month. They, have a little bit of a heads up on Carolina, but they're still a team that hasn't really been in his recruitment all that long, so it's not like he has long-term established relationships with them. So that is one to definitely monitor, especially if Carolina is still wanting to take on, some of those hybrid linebackers, and it looks like they are. It looks like they are wanting to add at least one hybrid linebacker in this class, whether that's him or Xavier Simmons. It feels like one of those guys will probably be a part of Carolina's class at this point. Let's, take a look at some of the guys that are coming up. We're going to touch on some of the guys from this weekend. I think the biggest one and the one that everybody's talking about right now is Andre Green Jr., the 4-star wide receiver out of St. Christopher's School in Richmond, Virginia. This feels like a pretty big visit for Carolina. Coming into the month, a lot of people felt like Carolina was in the driver's seat. It seemed like there was a lot of information to back that up. And then he goes to the prospect camp at Clemson. He ends up getting the offer that it seems like he has been seeking out for a while. Now, the good news is, and this was something that I kind of expected as well, I thought that it would have an effect on his recruitment, which it appears it has, but he did not commit on the spot. So it feels like Carolina's still got a really good opportunity here. It feels big for the Tar Heels, though, that they come out and impress this weekend. Is that kind of where you're at when it comes to the visit for the 4-star wide receiver out of the state of Virginia?
I think so, yeah. Like you mentioned, did visit Clemson and sort of get that offer that he was looking for. But same as North Carolina, I think Clemson is working with some tight numbers right now. Already have a wide receiver committed in the class in a local prospect, Adam Randall. Some Tar Heel fans might remember that name, as he did have some interest in North Carolina early. But I don't think that Clemson is looking to take more than one, maybe two more wide receivers in this class, and they are limited. They probably would have communicated that to Andre, and he didn't jump at the offer like some might have thought. So he strikes me as a kid. Obviously, he's been going all over the country, taking both official and unofficial visits. We'll take one, like you mentioned, in North Carolina, but I think he's a kid that is going through his recruitment in earnest at this point. Did spend this past weekend, I believe, at Georgia on an official visit after camping at Clemson. So I think they probably, if there's a third team, I think it's going to be Georgia. I know that they have some interest in, being involved there, but, this is one that's going to be a continued watch. I think that, he will likely go into this visit here in North Carolina. He's got some more visits scheduled, specifically an official to Oregon, sort of in this next week, and then an official in the fall to Notre Dame. I think that this is one that's going to go into the fall, just based on the number of visits he's trying to take all over the country. So, I do think that North Carolina has some equity built up here. I think they've been pretty consistent with him throughout this past dead period, and will sort of, help add to that with this official visit weekend. But this will be one similar to Jake Pope. It's going to be, a pretty hotly contested recruitment going into the fall. So, I do think that North Carolina is in good position and is certainly feeling better after coming out of this past week with him not jumping at that Clemson offer. This is going to be one where North Carolina is going to have to put up a fight into the fall and, really put that effort in.
Yeah, I think it really depends. I don't know with him, because I felt like before he got the Clemson offer, he was probably one of those guys that was a near lock to make his announcement before the start of the fall season. But now, I think there is probably going to be a little bit of an evaluation period from him, where he's going to kind of go through and try to, sort of evaluate what he thinks of Carolina, what he thinks of Clemson. Shocking that I feel like it's going to come down to a Clemson-Carolina battle. It seems like that's pretty much any big-time prospect that Carolina is going after, all of their major targets, it seems like, that remain in the class. Clemson is the team that seems to be the biggest challenger to Carolina with all of these guys. But I think one of the things is it really depends on what what happens this weekend. I think that if he feels like this is a perfect visit, this is everything that I'm looking for, I do think that there's a chance that he goes ahead and says, look, got the offer from Clemson, but yeah, there probably are other guys that are a little bit higher on their board. They already got Adam Randall in there. And look, you may be saying, well, Carolina's got a wide receiver commit in this class as well. That's true. Carolina does. But they've got a guy in Tyshun Chapman who is, I mean, he's the definition of a slot receiver. He's 5'10", he's 160 pounds. We talked about it when they landed him. He's going to be a guy that's going to probably, when he originally arrives on campus, he will be challenging for the backup spot or to try to get on the field in 4 wide receiver sets behind Josh Downs. He's pretty much going to be his clone the first couple of years on campus. Adam Randall is a guy who is 6'3", 198 pounds. He's a guy that goes up and gets the football. And again, Andre Green, he's 175 pounds, a little bit thinner. But both of those guys, their skill sets are rather similar. So I feel like, I think they would take him on for sure. They wouldn't offer him if they weren't going to. But I feel like if you're Andre Green and you think that the visit goes that well and you take a look at Clemson and say they've got a guy that does, has a skill set that's very similar to mine, Carolina is not in this class, he might go ahead and pull the trigger. So I think he's the guy that most people, and it seems like it's that way as we head towards the weekend. I think he's the guy that a lot of people are going to be keeping an eye on. And, another guy that's probably keeping an eye on that visit and that recruitment right now is Shalik Knotts, the in-state 4-star wide receiver that Carolina is also heavily pursuing at that position. A couple other guys that are expected to be on campus. One guy I think that we do have to talk a little bit in depth about here is Fisher Anderson, the 4-star offensive tackle out of Franklin High School in Franklin, Tennessee. It seems like, look, you've got Zack Rice, who I think is kind of head and shoulders above everybody else. He's a guy that, look, if he wants to commit to Carolina, even if they're full at the time when he decides that they are going to, or he's going to make his commitment, Carolina will clear space to add him to this class. Fisher Anderson seems to be that guy, though, that is right behind him. And there is, some thought that Carolina could take on 2 offensive tackles in this class. They have offered a lot of offensive tackles. Right now, the number sits at 14. That's the most of any position that they've offered in this class. And it feels like Anderson is probably priority number 2 right behind Zack Rice. And, the connection seems pretty good. He's still a guy that I think, from looking at where some of the stuff on 24/7 Sports is at in terms of, the hot, cold, warm. It seems like he's probably still, kind of going to mull over some things over the summer and will probably take this into the fall. But it feels like Carolina's got a really good chance to, if they're not already, establish themselves as the leader in his recruitment this weekend.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a background on him, pretty good academic guy. So looking at a lot of sort of these high academic schools, I believe looking at Michigan, Northwestern UVA. I believe he was at UVA this past weekend with Zack Rice. But, among those options, I do feel that North Carolina has built up, maybe not some buzz quite as of yet, but I think that they're doing well. They're staying pretty good in this recruitment. But as you mentioned, they are continuously offering offensive tackle prospects. So, this is a position in which, it might not just be Zack Rice. And, as we mentioned with Zack Rice, Zack Rice is not 100% a lock to North Carolina by any stretch. This is a guy that's, continuously taking visits and, will be hotly contested. So not only is there the possibility that they, if they get him, that they take, a third offensive lineman in this class, but also that they need to have options, in, the worst case scenario that Zack Rice goes somewhere else, they want to have another guy that's here available. And I think that, Fisher Anderson more than fits that spot as a guy that could be, a third offensive lineman or a replacement for Zack Rice in that scenario. So, this is just one of those things that you want to see from your staff. You want to see them building these relationships with more than just one prospect, not honing in just on one guy, but having these options that lets them sort of be selective when they really want to get down to brass tacks and, filling out these spots and understanding, who they're going to have to sort of fill out this class. So I think that this is a guy that, like you mentioned, he is going to go into this weekend, probably not. If I had to bet, I don't think that he's the guy that's necessarily going to, make his decision either coming out of the weekend or go somewhere else and pop. I think he's a guy that wants to take these visits and probably mull over everything. But, just a guy to just keep in the back of your mind. Obviously, as you mentioned, Zack Rice, largely head and shoulders, at least in most people's opinions, I think probably in the staffs as well, above the other offensive line prospects. But there are other guys on the board here that Tar Heel fans need to keep track of. And Fisher Anderson, I'd probably put at the, in that number 2 spot outside of Zack Rice.
Yeah, for sure. And the other guy, look, he's listed as an offensive tackle here. Travion Green I did pronounce that right. I want to make sure. He's going to probably project inside. And he's 6'7", he's 338. Again, he's a guy that if you didn't know his story, if you didn't listen to the edition of the podcast or read the article that we put up on the website, he's gone through pretty much a complete overhaul of his body and frame. He was a guy that was up over 400 pounds at one point. And that's part of the reason that he reclassified. So yeah, that's the other offensive lineman in this class. If you're sitting at home and saying 3 offensive linemen, who's that third guy? But it looks like he will probably kick inside. So that's going to be an area where Carolina has to get somebody in this class. I think that when you look at the biggest positions of need in this class, I think offensive tackle is probably the biggest. And we said that even early on last year when we were talking about Zack Rice in this class and about, the fact that there was a point where Carolina really hadn't offered a lot of guys around him. Fisher Anderson was one of those guys that was in there pretty early, but really it was pretty much Rice and Anderson, which we still didn't know much about at the time. And, we kind of said to ourselves, Carolina's got to offer somebody here because, you're looking at a guy in Jordan Tucker that a lot of people at the NFL level look at and see that look at him as a guy that has the size, he's got the pass protection ability. If he can have a really good season, he's probably going to go ahead and go to the NFL level. And there's still some uncertainty about some of the guys that are behind him in terms of experience. There's definitely some talent there. But this is another guy that, Fisher Anderson's a 4-star prospect. He's a blue chip guy. So you wouldn't mind adding him to a room where there is some uncertainty. So I definitely think Carolina is, they are going to do their homework here. As Zack mentioned, there are a couple other guys here that Carolina is really taking a hard look at. Kason Henry, who is expected to visit during this month. Not exactly sure. I believe he may also be on campus this weekend. He may be another guy that was expected to visit this weekend out of Walton High School in Marietta, Georgia. He could also be visiting with his teammate, Marcus Allen, next weekend, but not entirely sure about that. And then, a guy that Carolina had on campus, early on in the month of June, and extended an offer to in Justin Kanyuk out of Bethlehem Catholic in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. He's a guy that currently does not have any stars to his name, but again, he's another one of those guys that Carolina, I think, looks at as potentially another backup plan if they don't land one of these 2 guys that we just talked about, and is someone that I think if you're just looking at star rating, you need to kind of take a step back and realize that there once was a guy that came into his high school football championship game in his senior season with no stars and turned out to be one of the better running backs in Carolina history, especially in recent memory, and just got drafted in the 2nd round by the Denver Broncos. Of course, I'm alluding to Javonte Williams. So Carolina, that's a position where they are showing showing that they are going to be aggressive and they're going to try to land somebody at this point. A couple other guys that are going to be on campus that we know of. Caden Helms, the tight end out of Bellevue West High School in Bellevue, Nebraska. Carolina, they seem to have some momentum heading into that visit. It doesn't appear like they are the favorite, but the other team schools that are in his recruitment, it seems like Oklahoma probably is the favorite. They've got a pretty confident crystal ball prediction on 24/7 Sports, but Carolina is listed in the warmer category along with Oklahoma. And then Arizona State, that's a team that's listed as warmer. Not trying to project ahead, but in light of what has come out here in about the last 24 hours when we're recording this podcast, not really sure that Arizona State might still be in the thick of that recruitment. They've got some NCAA things that they're going to be going through here over the next couple of weeks and months, more than likely. We do know that Caden Helms is going to be on campus, though. And the other thing is, this is also the weekend where Carolina is going to host their premier prospect camp. So last weekend, they had, multiple camps. They actually had 4 camps where Mac Brown hosted a bunch of different prospects, guys from all over the country coming in, really just trying to impress the staff. A lot of the guys that came in and participated were guys that did not hold offers. There were a few guys that did, but this was mostly for the guys that were trying to earn some scholarship offers. A lot of younger kids there as well. Believe it or not, one of Antonio, or actually 2 of Antonio Cromartie's 13 kids were in attendance at Carolina's camp. So you did have, a lot of youth there, a lot of guys that, are just getting ready to come into their freshman seasons in high school, all the way up to guys that are going to be seniors but are still trying to earn scholarship offers that were there. This one, a little more focused. This is basically going to be Mac Brown's version of what Larry Fedora used to call the Freak Show. This is just called the Mac Brown Premier Prospects Camp. So you're going to have some real big names that are going to be on campus going through that camp this weekend in Chapel Hill. That pretty much wraps it up for this edition of the podcast. Make sure that you guys are following along on the website, HeelToughBlog.com. A whole bunch of great stuff on the website for you guys as we're taking you through this crazy month of June. And then it's really, this is a month unlike any other in terms of football recruiting. We've had you covered here for the first half of the month, had you covered with the Beau Atkinson commitment. Make sure you go online, read that article there. We kind of break down his game a little more in depth than even me and Zack spoke about here tonight. We're also going to have an article going up here soon on the website, which will tell you, some of the names to keep an eye out for as to who could be the next guy to commit to the class. That's one of those fun articles that we always like to write. So make sure you keep an eye out for that. Well, of course, after this weekend, with this being another official visit weekend, last weekend was really just a focus on those prospect camps. This weekend, I think, is going to be, one where we will probably get some pretty good information about the guys that are going to be on campus. So we will have some updates for you with another stock report. We are going to expect to put one of those up following the weekend of official visits. And after that, of course, as we mentioned, things will come to a halt pretty quickly after that. You'll have that final weekend of June where you'll have some significant prospects on campus. And then once they turn to the month of July, I believe that is pretty much it. They will put a halt on everything. It will go back into, another pseudo dead period until the fall. So then, Carolina just kind of sits back and waits. It feels like that month of July, though, could be pretty crazy, as that will be when a lot of those guys that we talked about who are, going through a bunch of official visits kind of weigh all their options and then go ahead and set and make decisions. So we'll have you covered through all of that on the website, HeelToughBlog.com. Also have you covered right here on the podcast. Plenty more of Zack Hubbard to come up here in the next couple of months. So make sure that you guys keep tuning into that. Of course, at the start of July as well, that's the thing. Once we flip the page from recruiting, we're going straight into preparations for this upcoming season, because we're going to end up doing the position previews. We're going to have those for you both on the website and on the podcast. That's right. We've done it in the last couple of years pretty much just offense, defense, special teams. This year, that's not the way that we're doing things. We're going to go position group by position group. We're going to give you a little more in-depth look at the guys. The podcast, of course, will be shorter than when we do the offensive and defensive previews, but it is going to give you a little more in-depth look at the position. We'll talk about all the guys that are going to be able to factor in at those positions throughout the year. There's some really great position battles that are currently going on that we're going to talk about as well, so you don't want to miss any of that. That'll be coming up. And then, of course, we'll have all, the great podcast editions like our 5 breakout players. We've done that the last couple of years. Those have been really interesting because some of the guys that we have predicted that were going to break out did not. Other guys we were spot on with, so make sure that you guys keep an eye out for all of that stuff. And we've still got, of course, interviews that are going on with former players. We're going to go through a lot of the off-season, the magazine guys that write all the previews. We're going to have all those guys on. We're hoping to get Phil Steele back on this year, Steven Lassen from Athlon Sports, all these great guys that have been with us before. We're hoping to get all those guys back on this year to talk about a Tar Heel team that is probably going to be about as nationally relevant as it's been definitely since that 2015 season, but probably since Mac Brown's first stint on campus with Carolina. So all of that, you want to make sure you subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss any of those editions. And also make sure you follow the Facebook page, Heel Tough Blog on Facebook. Just search it in the search bar at the top of the screen. Really would appreciate that, and you guys will as well when we bring back the video editions of the podcast, which are returning this year for some of the stuff that we're doing in season. Also, those previews that I talked about, the position previews, all are going to be on camera, so you don't want to miss any of that coming up with the Heel Tough Blog. So that wraps it up officially for this edition of the podcast. Want to thank Zack Hubbard for hosting with me. Want to thank you guys for listening, and as always, go Tar Heels!